This video will introduce you to an idea for an interactive timeline of policies throughout United States history contributing to racial inequality or equality for African Americans. As you can see, the timeline begins in 1600 and ends at the present day. The timeline's divided into 5 different categories, including essential freedoms, access to land and wealth, justice and equality under the law, access to political power, and access to quality education. The timeline is also divided into time periods, including the period of enslavement, which you can see lasted more than half of the time covered by this history. The Civil War, which led to the end of legal slavery and legislative changes meant to address inequality for African Americans. After the Civil War is another period during which numerous policies, programs, and practices solidified a system of racial inequality for African Americans across the nation. The Civil Rights Movement, a period in the ongoing struggle that resulted in policies meant to dismantle the American system of racial equality. And finally, we have the period after the Civil Rights Movement to 2013, which marks the beginning of the Black Lives Matter uprising. Each category of the timeline is populated by policies resulting in racial inequality. Each of these is numbered. Each category also includes the national policies, which are lettered, that were specifically proposed to lead to greater equity for African Americans. In the sheer number of racist policies throughout our history, the timeline makes clear that each attempt to address racial inequality is followed by attempts to erase those gains, which is why we find ourselves living in a society marked by ongoing racial injustice and social unrest. To interact with the timeline, you can hover over the number, and the title of these policies will pop up. For example, in the category of land and wealth, during the Civil War, the Homestead Acts, the end of slavery without land, education, or money, and the program of presidential reconstruction all contributed to greater inequality in the access to land and wealth for African Americans. Looking at the category of political power, we can see that immediately after African Americans were granted the right to vote, the backlash of white supremacy, black codes, white terrorism and lynching, incarceration, convict leasing and chain gangs, and voter prevention efforts all led to racial inequality for African Americans in the area of political power. Clicking on any of these policies, for example number 13, a bar pops up showing the length of this particular program, as well as a summary providing an introduction to this policy. The summary also provides links to other policies that are interrelated, as you can see here. This allows you to navigate between these interrelated policies and gain a better understanding of the history of attempts to undermine or support racial equality in the area of political power. So, for example, we see that the Civil Rights Movement led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, meant to restore voting rights for African Americans. We can also take a look at policy number 24, voter suppression efforts, that began immediately after the passage of the Voting Rights Act and continue to this day, designed to diminish the political power of African Americans. Each of these summaries also provide links to dive more deeply into the details of these policies based on your preferred learning style and whether you want additional information, you want to take action, or you're engaged in teaching on this topic. Ultimately, my hope is that this interactive timeline will provide you with a tool to understand the continuous and ongoing history of racial injustice that has been systematically built into the laws, policies, customs, and practices of the United States to the present day. The timeline allows you to deeply explore the history of U.S. racial policy in a single topic area, such as access to equal justice under the law, which includes mass incarceration, of which the current uprising against police brutality is just the tip of the iceberg. Alternately, the timeline provides you with a tool to to focus your study in a particular time period. For example, studying the policy accomplishments of the civil rights movement and the backlash and backtracking of injustice that followed. It is only through this kind of understanding that we can hope to remedy the wrongs of the past and fight for policies that promote equality and repair the historical and ongoing harm of racial injustice. My hope is also to help you consider what role you will play in the current uprising. I urge you to dive into this timeline with these questions in mind. Any number or any letter in the diagram will provide you with a doorway in. Learn the past, act in the present, help fix the future.